In Willowbrook Estates, North Carolina, a retired Marine sergeant was about to face his greatest battle on home soil. What started as a morning flag ceremony took a shocking turn when he encountered an HOA president's ultimatum. Benjamin Tank, Windwalker wasn't your typical suburban retiree. For 20 years, he had served as a decorated Marine, known for his unwavering honor and quiet dignity. When he encountered Karen Whitfield's demand to remove his weathered American flag, the same one that had draped his fallen son's casket, he refused. What began as a property dispute would become a national rallying cry when thousands of veterans converged to defend one Gold Star father's sacred memorial. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The flag caught the first light of dawn as Benjamin Tank, Windwalker, stepped onto his front porch, the weathered fabric stirring in the Carolina morning breeze. His movements carried the precision of 20 years in the Marines, measured, deliberate, reverent. The same hands that had once carried an M16 through Fallujah now gripped the rope with gentle care, raising the colors as he had every morning for the past 2 years. Behind her kitchen window, 3 houses down, Karen Whitfield watched through Venetian blinds, her coffee growing cold, as she documented what she'd come to think of as the neighborhood's most pressing problem. The flag was wrong. Obviously wrong to anyone with proper standards. The fabric showed wear along the edges, the red stripes had faded to something closer to rust, and the blue field carried the patina of age that marked it as distinctly not regulation. Benjamin stood at attention as the flag reached the top of the pole, his spine straight despite the arthritis that reminded him daily of his 48 years. For 30 seconds, he remained motionless, his dark eyes fixed on the colors that had meant everything to his son Matthew, the same flag that had draped the pine casket at Arlington, the same stars and stripes that had been folded with military precision and handed to Benjamin with the words, "On behalf of a grateful nation." Karen made a note on her phone. 1247 Oakwood Drive, non-regulation flag display, violation of community standards. She'd been elected HOA president 6 months ago on a platform of restoring Willowbrook's premier status, and that meant addressing the elements that didn't fit the vision of affluent suburban perfection. The morning ritual continued in silence. Benjamin's lips moved slightly, words only he could hear, a prayer or promise spoken to someone who would never answer. When he finally turned to go inside, his movements carried the weight of loss that civilian neighbors couldn't understand and didn't want to acknowledge. Robert Nighthawk emerged from his own front door as Benjamin's screen door clicked shut. The Army captain, recently retired after his own 20 years of service, understood the significance of the morning ceremony. He'd performed similar rituals in forward operating bases across 3 continents, knew the feel of fabric worn thin by desert sand and mountain wind. "Morning, Tank," Robert called softly, using the nickname that had followed Benjamin from Paris. Alien to the suburbs of North Carolina. Benjamin raised a hand in acknowledgement but didn't speak. Some mornings, the memories pressed too close to the surface for casual conversation, and Robert recognized the signs. They'd shared enough beers on Benjamin's back deck for him to understand that the flag ceremony wasn't about patriotism in the abstract. It was about Matthew. Karen finished her coffee and laced up her running shoes, preparing for her morning jog through Willowbrook's perfectly manicured streets. The subdivision represented everything she'd worked toward after her divorce, a chance to reinvent herself among people who valued the same things she did: order, standards, the kind of respectability that came from maintaining property values, and community reputation. Her route took her past the homes of 3 military families, and she made mental notes at each stop. The Johnsons had allowed their grass to grow too long between the sidewalk and curb. The Patels had planted flowers in non-regulation planters, and Benjamin Windwalker continued to display that embarrassing flag that made the whole neighborhood look shabby. What Karen couldn't understand, what she had never tried to understand, was that these weren't signs of negligence or disrespect. They were the habits of people who had spent years focused on missions that mattered more than lawn maintenance, warriors who measured success in lives saved rather than property values preserved. Benjamin drove his 10-year-old pickup to Pineland Cemetery, 20 minutes outside Willowbrook, the same journey he made every Thursday morning. The truck's Marine Corps bumper sticker had faded but remained readable, a small declaration of identity. In the civilian world that often felt foreign, Matthew's headstone stood in perfect alignment with hundreds of others in the military section, white marble marking lives cut short in service to country. Benjamin knelt beside the grave, his knees protesting against the damp earth, and began the conversation he'd been having for 2 years. "Morning, son. Your flag's still flying. Some folks think it needs replacing, but they don't understand what that means." His voice carried the controlled steadiness of someone who had learned to manage grief without letting it consume him. "They see worn fabric. I see every mission you flew, every convoy you protected." The wind stirred the small American flag planted beside the headstone, a miniature version of the one that flew over Benjamin's home. Both had been folded and presented at Matthew's funeral, but Benjamin had chosen to display one rather than keep both locked away in shadow boxes. He spent an hour at the grave, sharing news about Jessica's children, about the neighbors who didn't wave back, about the slow process of learning to live with loss that felt like a phantom limb. When he finally stood to leave, his movements carried the careful precision of someone honoring sacred ground. Karen's emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for that evening in the community center, a sterile room designed for the kind of bureaucratic efficiency she'd mastered in real estate. The agenda she'd prepared focused on neighborhood beautification initiatives and maintaining community standards, language carefully chosen to sound reasonable while targeting the military families she'd identified as problems. Tom Brennan would attend, as he had every meeting since moving to Willowbrook 5 years ago. His executive background had taught him the value of staying informed about community decisions, though he'd never paid close attention to the subtle politics of suburban governance. Robert Nighthawk had also received the meeting notice, and something in Karen's carefully worded agenda had triggered the tactical awareness that 20 years in combat zones had refined to instinct. He recognized the coded language of someone preparing for battle, even if the battlefield was a subdivision rather than a desert. As evening approached, Benjamin completed his daily routine. Dinner alone while watching the news, a brief walk around the neighborhood during which most residents avoided eye contact, and finally the evening flag ceremony that bookended each day. The colors came down with the same reverence they'd been raised, folded into the triangle that had covered his son's casket. Inside her immaculate home, Karen reviewed her presentation one final time. The photos she'd taken during her morning runs would demonstrate the deteriorating standards that threatened Willowbrook's reputation. The military families, with their relaxed approach to lawn care and their tendency toward practical rather than aesthetic choices, represented exactly the kind of influence that could drag down property values. What she couldn't see, what she had never learned to recognize, was that the worn flag flying over Benjamin's home carried more honor than every perfectly manicured lawn in the subdivision. It represented sacrifice she couldn't comprehend, loss she'd never experienced, and a love of country that transcended the superficial patriotism of suburban flag displays purchased new each Memorial Day. The stage was set for collision between two worldviews that had never learned to coexist, one that measured worth in appearances and property values, another that understood the true cost of the freedoms that made such concerns possible. In the pristine streets of Willowbrook Estates, a battle was about to begin that would test everything both sides believed about honor, respect, and what it meant to serve something greater than themselves. The community center's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the conference table as Karen Whitfield arranged her presentation materials with the precision of someone who had learned that controlling the details meant controlling the outcome. Her laptop displayed a PowerPoint titled Willowbrook Beautification Initiative, Preserving Our Community's Premier Status, and beside it lay a manila folder thick with photographs and violation notices she'd spent weeks compiling. Robert Nighthawk entered the room 15 minutes early, his military habit of arriving ahead of schedule serving him well in civilian bureaucracy. He took a seat toward the back, close enough to participate, but positioned to observe the dynamics that would unfold. Something about Karen's agenda had triggered his tactical instincts, the same sixth sense that had kept him alive during 3 tours in Afghanistan. Tom Brennan arrived precisely on time, his business attire and confident, bearing marking him as someone accustomed to boardroom meetings where millions of dollars hung on quarterly projections. He'd moved to Willowbrook for the same reasons as most residents: excellent schools, stable property values, and the kind of neighborhood where success was measured in well-maintained lawns and luxury vehicles. "Good evening, everyone," Karen began, her voice carrying the authority she'd cultivated during her real estate career. "Thank you for attending this important meeting about maintaining the standards that make Willowbrook Estates the premier residential community in Cumberland County." She clicked to her first slide, an aerial photograph of the subdivision that emphasized the uniform appearance of most homes. "As you can see, our community represents a significant investment for all residents. Property values here have consistently outperformed the regional average, but that success requires vigilance." Robert studied the faces around the table, reading the subtle body language that spoke of alliance and opposition. Karen had clearly done her political homework, surrounding herself with residents who shared her vision of suburban perfection. "Unfortunately," Karen continued, advancing to her next slide, "certain elements within our community have begun to compromise the aesthetic standards that protect our investment." The screen filled with photographs of military families' homes, grass that needed trimming, flower beds planted in practical rather than decorative arrangements, and prominently featured Benjamin's weathered flag catching morning light. Tom leaned forward, interested despite himself. His corporate background had taught him to appreciate well-maintained standards, and some of the photos did suggest a more relaxed approach to property maintenance than he preferred in a premium neighborhood. "The HOA covenants are clear about maintaining community standards," Karen said, citing specific sections with the fluency of someone who had memorized the regulations. "Displays that detract from neighborhood aesthetics are subject to violation notices and, if necessary, legal action." Robert felt the familiar tension of preparing for combat, not the physical confrontation of military service, but the bureaucratic warfare that could be just as destructive to the people caught in its crosshairs. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, his voice carrying the controlled respect of someone who understood chain of command, "could you clarify what specific violations you're documenting?" Karen's smile was practiced and cold. "Of course, Mr. Nighthawk. The photographs speak for themselves. Worn or inappropriate displays, inadequate lawn maintenance, non-conforming landscaping choices." She clicked through images methodically, building her case with the precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence. When Benjamin's flag appeared on screen, larger than the others, clearly the centerpiece of her presentation, Robert felt something shift in his chest. The image showed the flag at full staff in morning light, its worn fabric rendered in high resolution that emphasized every frayed edge and faded stripe. This particular display, Karen said, her pointer highlighting the flag, represents exactly the kind of deteriorating standard that threatens our community's reputation. The fabric is clearly non-regulation. The condition is inappropriate for a premier neighborhood, and the overall effect suggests a lack of pride in community appearance. Tom studied the photograph, noting the flag's obvious wear, while missing entirely the significance that Robert recognized immediately. To Tom's corporate eye, it looked like something that needed replacement, a simple matter of maintaining standards. I move that we issue formal violation notices to all properties documented in tonight's presentation, said Margaret Foster, one of Karen's carefully recruited allies. Property values don't maintain themselves. Robert stood slowly, his movement, carrying the deliberate weight of someone choosing his battlefield carefully. I'd like to speak to that motion. Karen's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd expected resistance from Robert. His military background made him a natural ally to the families she was targeting, but she'd positioned herself carefully for this confrontation. Mr. Nighthawk, she said with carefully controlled courtesy, while we appreciate your perspective, the HOA's responsibility is to all residents, not to any particular group or background. That flag, Robert said, gesturing toward the screen where Benjamin's colors still displayed, isn't just a display. It's a memorial. That particular flag covered the casket of Sergeant Windwalker's son when he came home from Afghanistan. The room fell silent, the weight of Robert's words shifting the atmosphere in ways Karen hadn't anticipated. Tom's corporate instincts recognized a public relations disaster in the making, while other board members began to understand they weren't simply discussing property maintenance. Karen recovered quickly, her political instincts guiding her response. While we certainly honor Mr. Windwalker's loss, personal circumstances don't override community standards. Every resident has stories and situations that matter to them, but we can't make exceptions based on individual hardships. Hardships? Robert's voice carried a dangerous edge that reminded everyone present of his military background. Mrs. Whitfield, that young man died serving his country. That flag represents his sacrifice, and you're calling it a hardship? Tom shifted uncomfortably, beginning to understand that this wasn't simply about property values. His business background had taught him to recognize when a situation carried implications beyond the immediate issue, and the tension in the room suggested deeper currents than aesthetic preferences. The HOA covenants apply equally to all residents, Karen insisted, but her voice had lost some of its confident authority. We can't create special categories based on personal circumstances, no matter how sympathetic. Margaret Foster seconded the motion for violation notices, but the enthusiasm that had marked the meeting's beginning had dissipated. Robert's revelation had introduced complexity that made simple enforcement seem callous, even to those who supported maintaining community standards. The motion passed by a narrow margin, 4 votes to 3, with Tom casting the deciding vote in favor of enforcement. His decision was based on legal precedent rather than personal conviction, but the weight of it settled on his shoulders. As the meeting concluded, as residents filed out of the community center, Robert approached Tom in the parking lot. "Mr. Brennan, you seem like a reasonable man. I hope you'll take time to understand what you voted for tonight." Tom nodded, though his expression suggested uncertainty rather than conviction. "I believe in maintaining standards, but I also believe in treating people fairly. I'll need to think about whether we achieved both tonight." Karen remained in the conference room after the others left, organizing her materials with satisfaction. The vote had been closer than she'd preferred, but she'd achieved her objective. The violation notices would go out tomorrow, and the process of bringing Willowbrook's military families into compliance with community standards would begin. What she didn't understand, what her focus on property values and aesthetic control had blinded her to, was that she'd just declared war on people who understood the true meaning of both service and sacrifice. The bureaucratic victory she'd achieved tonight would prove to be the first battle in a conflict she was destined to lose. Outside, Robert sat in his truck for several minutes before starting the engine, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he considered his options. Tomorrow, he would need to warn Benjamin about what was coming. Tonight, he would need to decide how far he was willing to go to protect his fellow veterans from an enemy they'd never trained to fight. The petty authoritarianism of suburban politics. The war for Willowbrook's soul had begun, and the first casualties would be measured not in blood, but in the dignity of those who had already sacrificed more than their neighbors could understand. The certified letter arrived on a Thursday morning, carried by a postal worker who had no idea she was delivering a declaration of war. Benjamin Windwalker accepted the envelope with the same quiet dignity he brought to all interactions with the civilian world, though something in the official weight of the correspondence made his hands pause before opening it. Inside his modest living room, walls decorated with Matthew's military photographs and commendations rather than the abstract art favored by his neighbors, Benjamin carefully opened the envelope. The letterhead read, "Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association," in serif font designed to convey authority, and the language that followed carried the sterile precision of bureaucratic ultimatum. "Notice of covenant violation," it began. "Property, 1247 Oakwood Drive. Violation, non-conforming flag display detrimental to community aesthetic standards. Required action, remove or replace display within 14 days to avoid penalties including fines and legal action." Benjamin read the notice 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of insult wrapped in legal language. His weathered hands, scarred from 20 years of military service and 2 years of grief, trembled slightly as he set the letter on his coffee table beside Matthew's Purple Heart, still in its presentation case. The flag they wanted him to remove wasn't just fabric and thread. It was the last tangible connection to his son's service, the final honor guard that had protected Matthew's journey from battlefield to home soil. Every fade mark and frayed edge carried meaning that no amount of HOA regulation could diminish. Benjamin walked to his front window, looking out at the flag that caught the morning breeze with familiar grace. He remembered the young Marine chaplain's words at Arlington. "This flag is presented on behalf of a grateful nation and the United States Marine Corps as a token of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service." Honorable and faithful service. The words echoed in the empty house as Benjamin considered his options. Compliance would mean folding away the last visible reminder of Matthew's sacrifice, replacing it with a store-bought flag that carried no history, no meaning, no connection to the young man who had died believing in something greater than himself. His phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Dad, heard about the HOA notice. Please don't do anything drastic. We can get you a new flag, and this whole thing will blow over." Benjamin understood his daughter's concern. Jessica had inherited her mother's practicality along with her protective instincts, and she'd watched her father struggle with Matthew's loss for 2 years. She feared that this confrontation might push him toward the edge he'd been walking since the funeral, but she didn't understand, couldn't understand what the flag represented. It wasn't decoration or patriotic display. It was sacred ground, as untouchable as Matthew's grave marker, as meaningful as the folded flag that sat in Benjamin's bedroom dresser beneath his son's final letter home. Robert Nighthawk's knock came at noon, the soft but insistent rap of someone who understood, the weight of difficult conversations. Benjamin opened the door to find his neighbor holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of a man preparing to share an unwelcome burden. "Got your notice?" Robert asked, settling into Benjamin's kitchen chair with the easy familiarity of shared military experience. 14 days, Benjamin replied, his voice carrying the controlled anger that 20 years of discipline had taught him to master. 14 days to remove my son from view because he's detrimental to community aesthetic standards. Robert had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, had seen good Marines torn apart by IEDs and bureaucratic indifference, but he'd never heard pain distilled into words with quite such precision. Benjamin's quiet fury was more dangerous than any. Explosive rage. It was the controlled response of someone who had identified his enemy and was calculating his response. "You know what they're really asking," Robert said carefully. "They want you to take down the flag that covered Matthew's casket and replace it with something that matches their idea of suburban perfection." "I know exactly what they're asking." Benjamin's hands remained steady as he sipped his coffee, but Robert could see the tension in his shoulders, the military bearing that emerged when civilians pushed too far. "The question is what I'm going to do about it." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 veterans who understood that some battles couldn't be avoided, only fought with honor. The kitchen window framed Benjamin's flag perfectly, the afternoon light making the worn fabric seem to glow with inner purpose. "Tank," Robert said finally, using the nickname that connected them to their shared service. "You know this isn't going to end with a simple refusal. Karen Whitfield isn't the type to back down when challenged." Benjamin nodded, his mind already working through the tactical situation with the precision that had made him an effective Marine sergeant. "Let her come. I've faced worse enemies than suburban HOA presidents." "Have you?" Robert's question carried weight that made Benjamin look up sharply. "Those enemies shot at you with weapons you understood. This one uses lawyers and regulations and community pressure. She fights battles designed to make you look unreasonable for defending what's sacred to you." The truth of Robert's words settled between them like smoke from distant fires. Benjamin had trained for conventional warfare, had led Marines through firefights and urban combat, but he'd never faced an enemy who weaponized civility and used community standards as ammunition. His response, when it came, carried the finality of orders issued under fire. "Then I'll learn her battlefield. But I won't surrender Matthew's flag to make Karen Whitfield feel better about her property values." Robert pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts that connected him to a network of veterans scattered across 3 states. "You're not fighting this alone. Give me 24 hours to make some calls." After Robert left, Benjamin sat alone in his living room, surrounded by the photographs and memories that marked his son's brief life. Matthew's high school graduation picture showed a young man eager to serve, enlisted at 17 with his father's reluctant permission. His Marine dress blue portrait captured the pride of earning the title that had meant everything to both, father and son. The final photograph, Matthew in combat gear, arm around a fellow Marine in front of an Afghan mountainscape, had arrived 3 weeks before the casualty notification officers knocked on Benjamin's door. In it, Matthew's smile carried the confidence of someone who believed his mission mattered, who trusted that his sacrifice would be honored by those who sent him to war. Benjamin opened his laptop and began typing his response to the HOA violation. "Notice." The words came slowly at first, then with increasing clarity, as he found the language to explain what couldn't be explained to people who had never served anything greater than their own comfort. "Mrs. Whitfield," he wrote, "the flag you want me to remove covered my son's casket when he came home from Afghanistan. It represents his service to this country and his sacrifice for the freedoms you exercise when you complain about property. Of values, I will not remove it, replace it, or apologize for displaying it. If you wish to pursue legal action, I will meet you in court and explain to a judge exactly what you're asking me to do." He printed the letter, signed it with the careful script that had marked 20 years of military correspondence, and sealed it in an envelope addressed to the Willowbrook Estates HOA. Tomorrow, he would hand-deliver it to Karen Whitfield's office, and she would learn that some battles couldn't be won with citations and fines. The war for Matthew's honor had begun, and Benjamin Windwalker had chosen his ground carefully. He would not retreat, would not compromise, and would not allow his son's memory to be sacrificed on the altar of suburban conformity. Outside, the flag continued its eternal dance with the Carolina wind, each movement a prayer, a promise, and a declaration that some things remained sacred even in a world that had forgotten the true cost of freedom. The call came to Sergeant Major William Top Blackhorse at 0530 hours, 20 minutes before Reveille, at Fort Bragg. Robert Nighthawk's voice carried the controlled urgency of someone who had learned to communicate vital intelligence without, revealing classified details, even on unsecured civilian lines. "Top, we have a situation developing in Willowbrook. One of our own is under attack." Blackhorse sat up in his quarters, instantly alert despite the early hour. 15 years of friendship with Benjamin Windwalker had taught him to recognize when his former squad leader needed support, though he'd never expected the threat to come from Benjamin's own neighborhood. "How bad?" Blackhorse asked, already reaching for his uniform. "Bad enough. HOA president targeting Tank's flag, the one from Matthew's funeral, giving him 14 days to remove it or face legal action." The silence that followed carried the weight of shared understanding. Blackhorse had been at Matthew's funeral, had helped fold the flag that now flew over Benjamin's home, had watched a decorated Marine sergeant bury the son who had followed in his footsteps. The idea that civilians would target that sacred display triggered protective instincts that ran deeper than military regulation. "I'll make some calls," Blackhorse said. "This doesn't end today." His first call went to Colonel Maria Stormdancer at 0600, catching her in her office, where she'd already been working for an hour. The Apache officer, who commanded the 82nd Airborne support elements, had a reputation for fierce loyalty to her people, and Benjamin Windwalker had been one of her most reliable NCOs during his final years of service. "Colonel, we have a situation developing in Willowbrook Estates. Benjamin Windwalker is being targeted by his HOA for displaying his son's funeral flag." Stormdancer's response was immediate and sharp. "Explain." Blackhorse briefed her on the violation notice, Karen Whitfield's campaign against military families, and Benjamin's refusal to comply with the demand to remove Matthew's flag. With each detail, he could hear the colonel's anger building, the controlled fury of a commander whose people were under attack. "Sergeant Major," she said, when he finished, "I want a complete intelligence report on this situation within 4 hours. Contact information for this HOA president, legal background on the subdivision's covenants, and a list of every military family in that neighborhood. If someone wants to target our Marines, they'll discover what that really costs." Karen Whitfield's Thursday morning began with the satisfaction of knowing her beautification campaign was proceeding on schedule. The violation notices had been delivered, and she expected swift compliance from residents who understood the importance of maintaining community standards. Her real estate background had taught her that most people back down when faced with official paperwork and the threat of legal consequences. Her confidence lasted until Benjamin Windwalker walked into her office at precisely 1000 hours, carrying an envelope and wearing the bearing of someone accustomed to facing difficult situations. With dignity and tact, "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, placing the envelope on her desk with careful precision, "my response to your violation notice." Karen opened the letter with the casual authority of someone who expected contrition and compliance. Instead, she found herself reading a declaration of war written in the measured language of someone who had learned to communicate with absolute clarity under pressure. The final paragraph made her hands tremble slightly. If you wish to pursue legal action against a Gold Star father for honoring his fallen son, I will meet you in court and explain to a judge exactly what you're asking me to do. I suggest you consider carefully whether that's the battle you want to fight. Mr. Windwalker, she said, forcing her voice to remain steady, I understand this is personal for you, but HOA covenants exist for everyone's benefit. We can't make exceptions based on individual circumstances. Benjamin's response carried the quiet authority of someone who had led Marines through combat. Ma'am, that flag represents my son's service to this country. It's not a decoration or a personal preference. It's a memorial to a young man who died believing his sacrifice would be honored by the people he protected. I'm sorry for your loss, Karen said, the words carrying rehearsed sympathy rather than genuine understanding. But property values affect every resident. We have a responsibility to maintain standards. Benjamin studied her face for a long moment, recognizing the fundamental disconnect between someone who measured worth in dollars and someone who understood the true cost of freedom. Mrs. Whitfield, my son died so you could have the right to worry about property values. I'd suggest you remember that before you decide to dishonor his memory. He turned and walked out, leaving Karen staring at a letter that had just made their conflict personal in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for her phone to call the HOA's legal counsel. Across town, Rebecca Hart was reviewing her notes from the previous evening's school board meeting when her editor assigned her to cover a community dispute developing in Willowbrook Estates. Local news rarely generated the kind of controversy that built journalistic careers, but something about the brief description, HOA targeting military families' flag display, triggered her instincts for stories that carried deeper meaning. Her preliminary interviews with neighbors revealed a community divided along lines that weren't immediately obvious. The Patels, an immigrant family whose son was serving his second deployment in Iraq, spoke carefully about maintaining good relationships while clearly supporting Benjamin. The Hendersons, longtime residents who had moved to Willowbrook for its exclusivity, expressed frustration with people who don't understand community standards. Tom Brennan agreed to meet with her at a coffee shop near the subdivision, his corporate background making him careful about on-the-record statements, while his growing unease about the HOA's actions pushed him toward transparency. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I voted to enforce the covenants, he admitted, stirring his coffee with the nervous energy of someone questioning his own decisions. But I'm beginning to understand that I may have voted for something I don't actually support. What changed? Your mind? Rebecca asked, her journalism training helping her recognize the moment when an interview subject was ready to reveal something significant. I did some research after the meeting, looked up Sergeant Windwalker's son, learned about his service record, his medals, the circumstances of his death. Tom's voice carried the weight of delayed understanding. That flag isn't just a decoration, it's a shrine. Rebecca's investigation continued throughout the afternoon, each interview revealing new layers of complexity in what had initially appeared to be a simple property dispute. The military families spoke carefully but with obvious anger about feeling targeted for their service. The civilian residents expressed varying degrees of support for maintaining standards, though most seemed uncomfortable when forced to confront the specific implications of their positions. By evening, Rebecca had identified the central tension that would drive her story, a community grappling with the question of whether respect for military service outweighed adherence to suburban conformity. It was a microcosm of larger cultural divides, played out in a subdivision where property values and patriotism had collided with devastating personal loss. Jessica Windwalker called her father as the sun set over Fort Bragg, her voice carrying the worry that had been building since she'd learned about the HOA confrontation. "Dad, please tell me you're not going to make this into something bigger than it needs to be." "Jessica," Benjamin replied with the patient tone he'd used when she was young and worried about things beyond her control, "this was never about me. It was about Matthew, and I won't let anyone dishonor your brother's memory to protect their property values. But what if they take legal action? What if this costs you the house?" Benjamin looked out his window at the flag that caught the last light of day, its worn fabric dancing with familiar grace. "Some things are worth more than houses, sweetheart. Your brother died believing that. I won't prove him wrong by backing down from a fight over his honor." As night settled over Willowbrook Estates, the pieces of a larger conflict continued to fall into place. Colonel Stormdancer was mobilizing resources that Karen Whitfield couldn't imagine. Rebecca Hart was crafting a story that would transform a local dispute into regional news. And Benjamin Windwalker was preparing for a battle that would test everything he believed about honor, sacrifice, and the price of standing for principle in a world that often preferred the comfort of compromise. The storm that would soon engulf the quiet subdivision was still gathering strength, but the first thunder had already begun to rumble across the Carolina sky. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when Benjamin Windwalker was 20 miles away, kneeling beside Matthew's grave at Pineland Cemetery. Karen Whitfield had watched his truck disappear down Oakwood Drive at precisely 0900 hours, her surveillance born of the obsessive attention to detail that had made her successful in real estate and dangerous as an HOA president. She had been planning this moment for 3 days, ever since Benjamin's letter had made it clear that legal threats wouldn't be enough to force compliance. The violation notice had expired without response, and her lawyer had advised that HOA enforcement required documentation of ongoing violations. What better documentation could there be than photographic evidence of the offending display's removal and proper disposal? Karen crossed the street with purposeful strides, wearing gardening gloves and carrying the kind of utility knife she used for staging homes for sale. In her mind, she was performing a public service, removing a deteriorating eyesore that threatened the community's carefully maintained standards. The personal significance that Benjamin attached to the flag was irrelevant. HOA covenants applied equally to all residents, regardless of their emotional attachments. The flagpole stood 18 feet high, painted white and maintained with military precision, despite its age. The flag itself moved gently in the morning breeze, its worn fabric catching sunlight that emphasized every frayed edge and faded stripe. To Karen's eye, it looked exactly like what it was, old, weathered, inappropriate for a premium neighborhood. She had not paused to consider that this particular flag had been folded by honor guards at Arlington National Cemetery, presented to a grieving father with words of national gratitude, or flown over a dozen combat outposts where Matthew Windwalker had served. In her calculus, it was simply non-compliant material that needed removal. The rope system was more complex than she'd anticipated, requiring several minutes of fumbling before she managed to lower the flag to eye level. As the fabric descended, she felt a surge of satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of decisive action that effective leadership required. Property values demanded difficult decisions, and she was prepared to make them. With practiced efficiency, Karen cut the flag free from its grommets and folded it roughly, not with the 13 ceremonial folds that military tradition required, but with the casual handling of someone disposing of old fabric. She carried it across the street to her own backyard, where she had prepared a small fire pit for proper disposal. The burning began as a practical matter. Karen's research had indicated that worn flags should be destroyed by fire, though she had not investigated the ceremonial protocols that typically accompanied such destruction. She simply struck a match and touched it to one corner, watching as the flames spread across fabric that had absorbed the sand of Helmand province and the tears of a father who had lost everything that mattered. The smoke rose in dark spirals that carried the acrid smell of burning synthetic fibers mixed with the accumulated dust of foreign battlefields. Karen watched with satisfaction as the evidence of her neighborhood's most persistent violation disappeared into ash and memory. She did not see Robert Nighthawk emerge from his garage in time to witness the flames consuming his friend's most sacred possession. She did not notice the way his face went pale as he recognized what was burning, or the trembling in his hands as he reached for his phone to call 911. Emergency services. The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional. I need to report destruction of property at 1247 Oakwood Drive, Robert said, his voice tight with controlled fury. Someone just burned a military funeral flag. Sir, are you reporting vandalism or... I'm reporting the desecration of a memorial to a fallen Marine, Robert interrupted, his words carrying the authority of someone who understood exactly what he was witnessing. I need police response immediately. Benjamin returned from the cemetery at 10:30 hours, his weekly visit to Matthew's grave having provided the sense of connection that helped him navigate another week of civilian life. The empty flagpole registered in his peripheral vision first, a wrong note in the symphony of routine that had sustained him for 2 years. He stopped his truck in the driveway and stared at the bare pole for several seconds, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were reporting. The flag was gone, not lowered for weather or ceremony, but completely absent. The rope hung loose, cut cleanly at the point where Matthew's colors should have been attached. The smell of smoke drifted across from Karen's backyard. Benjamin moved with the controlled precision of someone approaching a casualty site, each step measured despite the growing certainty that something irreplaceable had been destroyed. When he reached the fence line and saw the smoldering remains, in Karen's fire pit, the world went silent except for the sound of his own heartbeat. Ash and fragments of red, white, and blue fabric were scattered around the metal basin. A corner of blue field had survived the flames, showing 2 white stars that seemed to stare accusingly at the man who had failed to protect them. The smell was unmistakable, synthetic fibers and the metallic tang of burned thread. Mrs. Whitfield. Benjamin's voice carried across the fence with dangerous calm. Karen emerged from her back door, wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had solved a persistent problem. Mr. Windwalker, I documented the covenant violation and disposed of the non-compliant display. You'll receive notice that the issue has been resolved. Benjamin stared at her for a long moment, his mind cycling through responses that ranged from physical violence to complete withdrawal. 20 years of military discipline warred with 2 years of accumulated grief and the primal rage of watching someone desecrate his son's memory. That flag, he said finally, his words carrying the weight of absolute certainty, covered my son's casket. I'm sorry for your loss, Karen replied with practiced sympathy, but personal circumstances don't override community standards. You had 14 days to replace it with appropriate material. Robert arrived as the first police car pulled into the subdivision, his witness testimony already prepared and his phone containing photographs of the burning that would serve as evidence. Officer Martinez, a veteran himself, took one look at the smoldering remains and understood immediately that this was more than simple property destruction. Ma'am, he said to Karen, are you saying you burned this gentleman's flag? I disposed of non-compliant HOA violation in accordance with proper flag retirement procedures, Karen replied, apparently unaware that her careful phrasing was creating a legal record of deliberate destruction. "Did you have permission to enter his property and remove his flag?" The HOA has authority to enforce covenant violations. Officer Martinez looked at Benjamin, recognizing the controlled fury of a veteran, watching his service be dishonored by someone who had never risked anything for anyone else. "Sir, how would you like to proceed?" Benjamin studied Karen's face, seeing not malice, but the complete absence of understanding that made her actions somehow worse than deliberate cruelty. She had destroyed Matthew's memorial, not from hatred, but from the casual indifference of someone who couldn't recognize the sacred when it stood directly in front of her. "I want her arrested for destruction of property," Benjamin said quietly, "and I want it on record that she burned a military funeral flag to enforce neighborhood aesthetics." As Officer Martinez read Karen her rights, Rebecca Hart arrived with a photographer, having monitored police scanner traffic for breaking news. The images they captured, Karen in handcuffs, Benjamin standing beside his empty flagpole, the smoldering remains of his son's flag, would be transmitted to news outlets across the country within hours. The point of no return had been reached. Karen Whitfield had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, violating something so fundamental that no amount of legal maneuvering could repair the damage. She had just created a national story about an HOA president who burned a Gold Star father's flag to protect property values. The war for Willowbrook's soul had claimed its first casualty, and the battle lines were now drawn in ash and ember. What happened next would determine whether Benjamin's stand for principle would transform his community or destroy everything he had left to lose. Rebecca Hart's first story went live at 6:47 p.m. on WRAL-TV, less than 8 hours after Karen Whitfield had struck the match that would ignite a national firestorm. The footage was devastating. Surveillance camera video showing Karen cutting down the flag, photos of the burning ceremony in her backyard, and most damaging of all, her on-camera statement defending her actions as necessary enforcement of community standards. By 10 p.m., the story had been picked up by CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC. The video of smoke rising from Benjamin's flag played on loop across cable news networks, each cycle adding new layers of outrage to a story that seemed to crystallize everything wrong with bureaucratic overreach and civilian indifference to military sacrifice. Social media exploded with hashtags that trended nationwide: Gold Star flag, Willowbrook shame, and Honor Matthew. The American Legion's national Twitter account posted a statement calling for Karen's prosecution under federal flag desecration laws. The VFW announced they were organizing a convoy to North Carolina to deliver a new flag personally. Colonel Maria Stormdancer watched the coverage from her office at Fort Bragg, her Apache heritage giving her a warrior's understanding of how battles could shift from tactical skirmishes to total war in a matter of hours. Karen Whitfield had just made the catastrophic error of attacking not just one Marine, but the entire military community's sense of honor and sacrifice. Her first call went to the Pentagon's Public Affairs Office. "This is Colonel Stormdancer at Bragg. I need authorization for a full honors ceremony for a fallen Marine whose memorial flag was destroyed by civilian authorities." The second call went to Benjamin directly. "Tank, this is Colonel Stormdancer. I'm watching the news, and I want you to know that what happened today will not stand. How are you holding up?" Benjamin sat in his living room, surrounded by condolence letters that had begun arriving by email faster than he could read them. His phone had been ringing constantly. Reporters, veterans organizations, strangers from across the country offering support and expressing outrage at Karen's actions. "Colonel," he said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting battles on multiple fronts, "I never wanted this to become a circus. I just wanted to honor my son. Tank, sometimes the circus finds us whether we want it or not, But this isn't about media attention. It's about making sure Matthew's sacrifice is honored properly. Can you handle one more ceremony if we do it right this time? What are you thinking? Full military honors, guard detail from the 82nd, new flag presented by Gold Star families from across the region. We'll show this HOA president and anyone else who's watching what it really means to honor our fallen. No, 3 states away, Sergeant Major Blackhorse was making his own calls to a network of veterans that stretched from Quantico to Camp Pendleton. The Marine Corps was a brotherhood that protected its own, and the image of Benjamin standing beside his empty flagpole had triggered protective instincts that transcended individual service branches. "Listen," he told each contact, "one of our own just had his son's flag burned by some suburban HOA president. We're organizing a response that'll make sure this never happens again. How many people can you bring to North Carolina this weekend?" The response was immediate and overwhelming. Marine units from Camp Lejeune offered formal honor guards. Army veterans from Fort Bragg volunteered convoy vehicles. Air Force personnel from Seymour Johnson pledged air support for what was rapidly becoming the largest military gathering in civilian territory since the Vietnam War protests. Karen Whitfield's Thursday evening began with satisfaction and ended with lawyers, public relations consultants, and a security detail recommended by her real estate firm. The woman who had burned a flag to protect property values now found herself the most hated person in America, receiving death threats from across the country and watching her real estate business collapse in real time. Her interview with Rebecca Hart, conducted 6 hours after the flag burning when she still believed she could control the narrative, proved to be a masterpiece of self-destruction. Asked to explain her actions, Karen had doubled down on her position with the confidence of someone who believed property values trumped sentiment. "Every resident has stories that matter to them," she said, looking directly into the camera with practiced real estate authority. "But we can't make exceptions based on individual circumstances. If we allowed one non-compliant flag because of personal tragedy, where would it end?" The interviewer's follow-up question came like a precision strike. "Mrs. Whitfield, are you saying that a Gold Star family's grief is just another individual circumstance that doesn't justify respecting their son's memory?" Karen's response would be replayed on news programs for weeks. "I understand that military families feel entitled to special treatment, but community standards exist for everyone's benefit. Property values don't maintain themselves." By midnight, community standards had become a national punchline, while entitled military families was being used as evidence of Karen's fundamental disconnect from American values. Her attempt to justify the flag burning had transformed her from a misguided HOA president into a symbol of everything civilians didn't understand about military service and sacrifice. Tom Brennan's crisis of conscience reached its breaking point. As he watched Karen's interview from his home office, his corporate background had taught him to recognize public relations disasters, but seeing Karen defend the flag burning made him understand that this was more than bad publicity. It was a moral catastrophe that demanded personal response. His resignation letter from the HOA board took 20 minutes to write and would be quoted in newspapers across the country. "I cannot and will not serve on a board that sanctions the desecration of military memorials to protect property values." Mrs. Whitfield's actions represent everything that is wrong with civilian attitudes toward those who serve our country. Jessica Windwalker drove to her father's house through streets lined with news vans and protesters, some supporting Benjamin, others carrying signs about property rights and community standards. The quiet neighborhood where she had encouraged her father to find peace had become a battleground that would determine whether military families could find respect in civilian communities. She found Benjamin in his kitchen, reading emails from Gold Star families across the country who had shared their own stories of bureaucratic harassment and civilian indifference. Each message was a reminder that his fight was bigger than one flag, one HOA, or one father's grief. "Dad," Jessica said, settling beside him with the careful attention of someone approaching a wounded animal, "are you okay with what this is becoming?" Benjamin looked out his window at the empty flagpole that had been photographed by dozens of news crews throughout the day. "Your brother believed his service mattered. Today, thousands of strangers proved he was right. How can I not be okay with that?" Outside, the first RVs were arriving in the subdivision, veterans making the pilgrimage to Willowbrook to support a fellow warrior whose son's honor had been violated. The quiet streets that Karen had worked so hard to perfect were about to be transformed into something she could never have imagined, a gathering place for people who understood the true meaning of service, sacrifice, and the price of freedom. The response to Karen's flag burning was building into something unprecedented, a demonstration of military solidarity that would either heal the divide between civilian and military communities or tear it wider than ever before. Benjamin Windwalker had become the unwilling center of a national conversation about respect, honor, and what America owed to those who had sacrificed everything in its service. The storm was no longer gathering. It had arrived with the force of moral outrage and military brotherhood, and Karen Whitfield was about to discover that some battles couldn't be won with lawyers, regulations, or property management expertise. Dawn broke over Willowbrook Estates to the rumble of diesel engines and the sight of vehicles that had never before traveled the subdivision's manicured streets. Military transport trucks, personally owned convoy vehicles, and motorcycles bearing POW MIA flags formed a procession that stretched back to the interstate, their destination a simple ranch house at 1247 Oakwood Drive. Colonel Maria Stormdancer led the convoy in a command vehicle flying the colors of the 82nd Airborne, followed by honor guards from every service branch represented at Fort Bragg. Behind them came a parade of American military history, Vietnam veterans on Harley-Davidsons, Iraq and Afghanistan, veterans in pickup trucks, Gold Star families from across the Southeast carrying folded flags and photographs of their own fallen children. Benjamin Windwalker stood on his front porch, overwhelmed by the sight of hundreds of vehicles converging on his neighborhood to honor a son he'd been mourning. Alone for 2 years, the empty flagpole beside him, stark against the morning sky, had become a symbol that drew supporters from across the country. The convoy's arrival transformed the quiet subdivision into something unprecedented. Oakwood Drive disappeared under a sea of people, flags, and military vehicles as veterans, active duty personnel, and civilian supporters gathered for what would become the largest military ceremony ever held in a residential neighborhood. Robert Nighthawk served as unofficial liaison, directing traffic and coordinating with local police who had closed several streets to accommodate the gathering. His diplomatic skills were being tested as news crews, veteran organizations, and curious neighbors created controlled chaos in streets designed for suburban tranquility. "Sir," he reported to Colonel Stormdancer as she emerged from her vehicle in full dress uniform, "we have representatives from 43 veteran organizations, 12 active duty units, and approximately 800 civilians. Local fire department estimates total attendance at over 2,000 people." Stormdancer surveyed the crowd with the tactical eye of someone accustomed to managing large-scale operations. And Mrs. Whitfield, barricaded in her house with private security, hasn't been seen since the story broke yesterday. 3 houses down, Karen Whitfield watched the gathering through closed blinds, her world transformed into something she couldn't comprehend. The property values she'd worked so hard to protect were meaningless now that her neighborhood had become a pilgrimage site for every veteran in the Southeast. Her phone rang constantly with interview requests, death threats, and resignation. Demands from the remaining HOA board members. The ceremony began at 1,000 hours with a precision that demonstrated military organization at its finest. Colonel Stormdancer stepped forward to address the crowd, her voice carrying clearly across the packed street through a sound system borrowed from the base chapel. We gather today not to protest or to punish, but to honor the memory of Lance Corporal Matthew Windwalker, who died serving his country in Afghanistan, to honor his father, Sergeant Benjamin Windwalker, whose dedication to his son's memory has reminded us all what it means to serve something greater than ourselves. The crowd fell silent as honor guards from all 5 service branches marched in formation toward Benjamin's empty flagpole. Each carried a flag, not just American colors, but the banners of military units that had served alongside Matthew during his deployment, flags that had flown over combat outposts where young Marines had fought and died for principles that transcended property values. Jessica Windwalker arrived with her children just as the ceremony reached its emotional center. Her 8-year-old son carried a photograph of the uncle he'd never met, while her 6-year-old daughter clutched a small American flag that she'd insisted on bringing to honor Grandpa's soldier boy. Tom Brennan stood at the edge of the crowd, representing civilian neighbors who were beginning to understand what they'd witnessed when Karen burned Benjamin's flag. His resignation from the HOA board had been quoted in national news coverage, making him an unlikely spokesman for community members who opposed the flag burning. "I voted to enforce those covenants," he told Rebecca Hart in a follow-up interview. "I thought I was protecting property values. I didn't understand that I was attacking the memorial of a young man who died for his country. That's not who I want to be, and it's not who this community should be." The new flag, provided by the Marine Corps and blessed by chaplains from multiple faiths, was raised with the ceremonial precision of a funeral at Arlington. As the colors reached full staff, bugler played taps while 2,000 people stood at attention in a residential street that had been transformed into sacred ground. Benjamin stepped forward to address the crowd, his voice steady, despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. 2 years ago, I buried my son with the promise that his sacrifice would be remembered. Yesterday, someone tried to erase that memory to protect her property values. Today, you've proven that Matthew's service will never be forgotten." The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming. Cheers, applause, and the kind of unified support that demonstrated military brotherhood at its most powerful. Signs reading, "Honor our fallen," "Respect Gold Star families," and "Never forget Matthew," created a forest of support that stretched across the entire neighborhood. Gold Star mothers from across the region presented Benjamin with a quilt bearing Matthew's name alongside those of other fallen warriors, their shared grief creating bonds that transcended geography and circumstance. Each patch told a story of loss and sacrifice, creating a tapestry of service that honored not just Matthew, but every family that had paid the ultimate price. The ceremony concluded with the presentation of a permanent memorial marker, a granite stone bearing Matthew's name, service dates, and the inscription, "In honor of all who serve, all who sacrifice, and all who remember." The marker would be placed in Benjamin's front yard, creating a lasting reminder of what the neighborhood had witnessed. As the crowd began to disperse, participants left behind more than memories. The street was lined with flowers, American flags, and handwritten notes from strangers who had been moved by Benjamin's story. Children had drawn pictures of soldiers and flags, while veterans had left military coins and unit patches as tokens of respect. Karen Whitfield's house stood empty and dark, its windows covered and its yard notably absent of any patriotic display. The woman who had burned a flag to protect property values had discovered that some actions created consequences beyond legal liability or financial cost. She had made herself a pariah in her own community, a cautionary tale about the price of disrespecting military sacrifice. The convoy that had arrived at dawn departed in the late afternoon, leaving behind a neighborhood forever changed by what it had witnessed. Willowbrook Estates would never again be just another affluent subdivision. It had become a symbol of military-civilian unity, a place where ordinary people had chosen to honor extraordinary sacrifice. Benjamin stood beside his new flag as the last vehicles disappeared around the corner, surrounded by neighbors who had never before acknowledged his presence, but now understood the weight of what he carried. The empty feeling that had haunted him since Matthew's death was replaced by something he hadn't felt in 2 years, the knowledge that his son's sacrifice mattered to people beyond his own grieving heart. The Cumberland County Courthouse had never seen crowds like the ones that gathered for the hearing on Willowbrook Estates HOA ver. Benjamin Windwalker. Media trucks lined the street, while veterans in dress uniforms formed honor guards on the courthouse steps. Inside, every seat was filled with supporters who had traveled from across the region to witness what many considered a test of American values. Judge Victoria Strongbear entered the courtroom with the bearing of someone who understood both military service and civilian law. Her Mohawk heritage and Navy JAG background had prepared her for cases where legal technicalities collided with moral imperatives, but nothing had quite prepared her for the national attention focused on this particular property dispute. Karen Whitfield sat at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, Marcus Webb, an expensive lawyer specializing in HOA law, who had advised her that the case was legally straightforward. Property covenants were binding contracts, violation notices had been properly served, and the flag's destruction was simply enforcement of legitimate community standards. Your Honor, Webb began with practiced confidence, this case is about the fundamental principle that homeowner association covenants apply equally to all residents. Mr. Windwalker received proper notice of a covenant violation and refused to comply. The association had both the right and the responsibility to enforce community standards. Benjamin sat at the defendant's table with his court-appointed attorney, Sarah Chen, a young lawyer who had volunteered to represent him pro bono. After seeing the news coverage, beside him sat Robert Nighthawk and Jessica Windwalker, their presence providing moral support for a man who had never expected to fight his most important battle in a civilian courtroom. Webb presented his case with the methodical precision of someone who believed law existed separate from justice. He cited precedent cases where HOA enforcement had been upheld, quoted specific covenant language about appropriate displays, and argued that personal circumstances couldn't override binding legal agreements. The defendant's emotional attachment to this particular flag, while understandable, doesn't grant him special exemption from rules that apply to every other resident, Webb stated. If associations can't enforce their covenants consistently, then the entire concept of planned communities becomes meaningless. Judge Strongbear listened with the patience of someone who had heard similar arguments in dozens of property disputes, but her military background allowed her to recognize what Webb was missing. This wasn't simply about property law, it was about the collision between civilian bureaucracy and military honor, between property values and sacred memory. Mr. Webb, she interrupted, are you familiar with the federal flag code regarding the proper treatment of burial flags? Your Honor, while the flag code exists, it's generally considered advisory rather than... I'm not asking about general application. I'm asking if you understand that the flag your client destroyed was specifically protected under federal guidelines governing military funeral honors. Webb's confidence wavered slightly as he realized the judge was approaching the case from an angle he hadn't fully considered. Your Honor, the HOA's authority to enforce covenants doesn't exempt them from federal regulations, but you proceeded without considering whether destroying a military burial flag might violate federal law? Judge Strongbear's question carried the weight of someone who understood the sacred nature of military symbols. Sarah Chen rose to present Benjamin's defense, her youth and inexperience offset by the moral clarity of her client's position. Your Honor, this case isn't about property values or HOA authority. It's about whether a Gold Star father has the right to honor his fallen son without interference from neighbors who don't understand what military service costs. She presented evidence that Webb had overlooked: federal regulations protecting military burial flags, precedent cases where religious and memorial displays had been granted special protection, and expert testimony about the psychological importance of memorial rituals for grieving military families. Mrs. Whitfield didn't just violate HOA procedure when she entered Mr. Windwalker's property and destroyed his flag, Chen argued. She committed an act of desecration that violated federal law, state property rights, and basic human decency. The courtroom stirred as Chen introduced photographs from Matthew's funeral, honor guards folding the flag, the presentation ceremony at Arlington, Benjamin receiving the flag that would later be burned in Karen's backyard. The images transformed abstract legal arguments into visceral emotional reality. Benjamin took the witness stand with the same quiet dignity he brought to every aspect of his life, his answers carrying the weight of 2 years of grief and 20 years of military service. Mr. Windwalker, Chen asked gently, can you explain to the court what that flag meant to you? It was the last honor my son received, Benjamin replied, his voice steady despite the emotion underlying each word. When they handed it to me at Arlington, they said it was presented on behalf of a grateful nation. Mrs. Whitfield burned my nation's gratitude to protect her property values. Judge Strongbear studied Benjamin's face, recognizing the controlled pain of someone who had sacrificed everything for people who would never understand the cost. Her next question came from her military background rather than her judicial training. Sergeant Windwalker, in your 20 years of service, did you ever imagine you'd need to defend your right to honor your fallen son in your own front yard? No, ma'am. I thought that particular battle had been won by people like Matthew. Karen Whitfield's testimony proved to be a disaster of epic proportions. Under cross-examination, she revealed the depth of her ignorance about military culture and the callousness that had driven her to destroy Benjamin's most sacred possession. Mrs. Whitfield, Chen asked, when you burned that flag, did you know it had covered Lance Corporal Windwalker's casket? I knew it had personal significance, but HOA covenants don't make exceptions for individual circumstances. Individual circumstances? Is that how you characterize a young Marine's death in service to his country? Karen's response would be quoted in newspapers across the country. Every resident has stories that matter to them. We can't lower community standards every time someone has a personal tragedy. The courtroom erupted in gasps and angry murmurs. Judge Strongbear's gavel rang out sharply, but her expression showed that Karen's words had revealed everything the court needed to understand about her character and motivations. In her ruling, Judge Strongbear delivered justice with the precision of someone who understood both law and honor. She permanently enjoined the HOA from interfering with military memorial displays, awarded Benjamin damages for the emotional distress and property destruction, and ordered Karen's removal from HOA leadership. This court finds that Mrs. Whitfield's actions constituted not just a violation of property rights, but a desecration of military honors protected under federal law, Judge Strongbear stated. Her destruction of Lance Corporal Windwalker's burial flag was an act of such profound disrespect that it shocks the conscience of this court. The ruling went further, establishing precedent that would protect military families across the state from similar harassment. HOAs would no longer be able to target military memorial displays under the guise of community standards, and Gold Star families would have legal protection for their sacred symbols of loss and service. As the courtroom cleared, Benjamin found himself surrounded by supporters who had witnessed not just a legal victory, but a moral triumph. The flag that Karen had tried to erase from existence had been replaced by something even more powerful. A legal precedent that would protect military families for generations to come. Outside the courthouse, Rebecca Hart captured the image that would define the story's resolution. Benjamin standing beside his daughter and granddaughter, holding a copy of the court order that had just transformed personal grief into lasting justice. The battle for Willowbrook's soul had been won in a courtroom where law and honor had finally aligned to protect those who had sacrificed everything for people who too often forgot the price of their freedom. 6 months after the Convoy had transformed Willowbrook Estates into a pilgrimage site for military families, the subdivision bore little resemblance to the sterile perfection that Karen Whitfield had tried so desperately to preserve. American flags flew from dozens of homes, not the pristine, store-bought displays of suburban patriotism, but weathered colors that spoke of genuine respect for military service and sacrifice. Benjamin Windwalker stood in his front yard on Memorial Day morning, no longer alone in his daily flag ceremony. Robert Nighthawk joined him, along with Tom Brennan and a growing number of neighbors who had learned to understand the sacred nature of honoring fallen warriors. The memorial stone bearing Matthew's name had become an unofficial shrine, surrounded by flowers, military coins, and handwritten notes from visitors who continued to make pilgrimages to the quiet street where one father's grief had sparked a national conversation. The HOA elections in April had swept Tom Brennan into the presidency on a platform of military support and community healing. His first official act was to establish the Matthew Windwalker Memorial Fund, providing assistance to military families facing housing discrimination or bureaucratic harassment. The fund had already helped 12 families across 3 states, transforming Benjamin's personal loss into a force for protecting other veterans. "Morning, Tank," Tom said, settling beside Benjamin as they watched the flag catch the Carolina breeze. "Hard to believe it's only been 8 months since this all started." Benjamin nodded, his face carrying a piece that had been absent for 2 years. Matthew would have liked seeing his neighborhood full of military families. He always said he wanted to serve something bigger than himself. The demographic transformation of Willowbrook had been remarkable. Karen's departure, she'd sold her house at a significant loss and moved to a gated community in Raleigh, had created opportunities for military families who had previously been priced out of the premium subdivision. The Patel's son had returned safely from his deployment and moved into the house next to Karen's former residence. 3 Gold Star families had purchased homes specifically to be part of a community that understood their loss. Jessica Windwalker arrived with her children as the morning ceremony concluded, their weekly visit now including an expanded family that encompassed neighbors who had become genuine friends rather than distant acquaintances. 8-year-old Michael wore his Little League uniform, bearing a memorial patch for the uncle he'd never met, while 6-year-old Sarah carried fresh flowers for Matthew's memorial stone. "Grandpa," Michael asked with the directness of childhood, "is Uncle Matthew proud of what happened?" Benjamin knelt beside his grandson, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood that children needed truth, tempered with hope. "I think your uncle is proud that his sacrifice helped other military families find homes where they're respected and honored. That's what Marines do. We protect people, even after we're gone." The neighborhood's transformation extended beyond demographics to genuine community healing. The monthly potluck dinners that Tom had instituted drew dozens of families, creating bonds between civilian and military residents that transcended the cultural divide that had once defined Willowbrook. Children played together while parents shared stories of deployment separations, combat experiences, and the challenges of transitioning between military and civilian life. Rebecca Hart's coverage of the Willowbrook story had earned her a regional Emmy and a position with a national news network, but she continued to follow the community's evolution with the dedication of someone who understood she'd witnessed something unprecedented. Her follow-up story, How One Flag Changed a Community, had been picked up by news outlets across the country and nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in feature journalism. The real story isn't about the conflict, she explained to journalism students during a guest lecture at UNC Chapel Hill. It's about what happened after, how ordinary people chose to build bridges instead of walls, how civilian neighbors learned to honor military sacrifice, and how one man's grief became a catalyst for healing entire communities. The legal precedent established by Judge Strongbear's ruling had indeed protected military families across multiple states. The Windwalker decision, as legal scholars had dubbed it, was being cited in cases from California to Florida, creating a protective framework that prevented HOAs from targeting military memorial displays under the guise of community standards. Colonel Stormdancer visited Benjamin quarterly, their friendship having deepened through shared recognition that military leadership extended beyond active duty service. Her recommendation had resulted in Benjamin receiving the Secretary of Defense Medal for Exceptional Public Service, an honor recognizing civilians who had significantly advanced military family welfare. "You know, Tank," she said during her spring visit, "you've done more for military-civilian relations in 8 months than most of us accomplish in entire careers. Matthew's sacrifice is still protecting people." Benjamin's transformation from isolated griever to community advocate had surprised even those who knew him best. He now served on the board of 3 veteran organizations, testified before the state legislature about military family housing rights, and spoke at military installations across the Southeast about the importance of community integration for transitioning veterans. The anniversary of Matthew's death in August had been marked not with solitary mourning, but with a community-wide memorial service that honored all fallen warriors from military families in the subdivision. Gold Star mothers from across the region attended, creating a support network that extended far beyond Willowbrook's boundaries. Karen Whitfield's absence had become a cautionary tale taught in HOA management courses and property law seminars. Her attempt to prioritize property values over human dignity had cost her career, reputation, and any chance of rehabilitation in the real estate industry. The house she'd abandoned had been purchased by a Marine Corps family whose patriarch had lost both legs in Afghanistan, a bitter irony that wasn't lost on neighbors who remembered her campaign against military families. The evening news began featuring Willowbrook Wednesday segments, brief stories about community events, military family achievements, and the ongoing transformation of a subdivision that had become a model for civilian-military cooperation. The coverage consistently emphasized how individual choices to embrace, rather than exclude, had created lasting positive change. As autumn approached, Benjamin found himself preparing for another first, serving as Grand Marshal for the county's Veterans Day Parade. The invitation had come from a coalition of veteran organizations who credited his stand against the HOA with inspiring similar acts of courage across the region. "Dad," Jessica said as they planned his parade appearance, "are you comfortable being this public face for military families? It's a lot of responsibility." Benjamin looked out his window at the flag that flew with renewed purpose over a neighborhood that had learned to honor rather than tolerate military service. Matthew carried much bigger responsibilities when he was younger than you are now. The least I can do is carry this one for families who are still fighting battles they shouldn't have to fight alone. The healing that had begun with one father's refusal to surrender his son's memorial had spread beyond Willowbrook to encompass entire communities across the state. Benjamin Windwalker had discovered that sometimes the most important service happened not on foreign battlefields, but in suburban subdivisions, where ordinary people chose to do extraordinary things in defense of honor, sacrifice, and the simple human dignity that every warrior deserved. 2 years after Karen Whitfield had lit the match that changed everything, Benjamin Windwalker stood at his window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of red, white, and blue. The anniversary of Matthew's death had become something different than the solitary mourning that had once marked this day. It was now a celebration of how one young Marine's sacrifice continued to protect and inspire long after his final mission had ended. The memorial garden dedicated to Matthew and other fallen warriors occupied what had once been the subdivision's unused common area, transformed by community volunteers into a place of reflection and honor. Granite markers, bearing the names of local service members killed in action, stood among native Carolina plants, chosen for their ability to bloom throughout the seasons, ensuring that color and life surrounded the memories of those who had given everything. Benjamin's morning flag ceremony had evolved into a community ritual, with dozens of neighbors gathering at dawn to participate in what had become known as the Willowbrook Reveille. Children who had been too young to understand the original conflict now served as junior flag bearers, learning from their parents why this daily ceremony mattered more than any HOA regulation ever could. Tom Brennan approached the flagpole carrying coffee for both men, his transformation from reluctant ally to dedicated advocate complete in ways that still surprised him. His corporate background had proven invaluable in organizing the non-profit foundation that had grown from Matthew's memorial, fund into a national organization protecting military families from housing discrimination. "Morning, Benjamin," Tom said, using the first name that had replaced military formality as their friendship deepened. "You ready for today?" The dedication ceremony for the expanded memorial garden would draw visitors from across the country, including Gold Star families whose own battles with civilian bureaucracy had been won, using the legal precedent established by Benjamin's court victory. The Windwalker doctrine had been cited in over 200 cases, creating a protective legal framework that extended far beyond HOA disputes to encompass employment discrimination, educational access, and social services. Jessica Windwalker arrived with her children as the morning ceremony began, their weekly ritual now including reading names from the memorial wall, a practice that ensured fallen warriors from across the region remained part of the community's living memory. 10-year-old Michael had memorized his uncle's service record and could recite Matthew's awards and deployments with the precision of a military historian, while 8-year-old Sarah had started a pen pal correspondence with children from other Gold Star families. "Grandpa," Michael asked as they walked toward the memorial garden, "do you think Uncle Matthew knew that burning his flag would make all this happen?" Benjamin considered the question with the seriousness that children's wisdom deserved. "I think your uncle knew that standing up for what's right sometimes costs more than you expect to pay, but it also protects more people than you ever imagined it could." The dedication ceremony began at 1,000 hours with military precision that honored both the fallen and the community that had chosen to remember them. Colonel Stormdancer delivered the keynote address, her words carrying the authority of someone who had watched Benjamin's grief transform into a force for positive change that continued to ripple outward. 2 years ago, One father's refusal to surrender his son's memory sparked a national conversation about how we honor military sacrifice, she said, addressing the crowd of over 500 people gathered in the subdivision's transformed streets. Today we see the result, not just a memorial garden, but a community that has become a model for how civilians and military families can live together with mutual respect and understanding. Rebecca Hart covered the ceremony for her national news program, her Pulitzer Prize-winning series on Willowbrook, having established her as the definitive voice on military-civilian relations. Her camera crew captured images that would be broadcast across the country, children playing among memorial stones, Gold Star mothers embracing beside their sons' and daughters' markers, and Benjamin standing quietly beside Matthew's memorial, his face reflecting peace rather than the grief that had defined him for so long. The surprise of the day came when Judge Victoria Strongbear arrived to present Benjamin with a commendation from the state's Military Family Advocacy Coalition. Her ruling in the original case had made her an unexpected champion of veterans' rights, leading to her appointment to a federal commission studying military family housing issues. "Mr. Windwalker," she said, reading from a proclamation signed by the governor, "your courage in defending your son's memory has protected thousands of military families from discrimination and harassment. The state of North Carolina recognizes you as a champion of veterans' rights and a model of how individual actions can create lasting positive change." The most powerful moment came when Karen Whitfield approached Benjamin during the reception that followed the ceremony. Her transformation over 2 years had been as complete as his, from suburban autocrat to someone who had spent months in counseling, trying to understand how her actions had caused such profound pain. "Mr. Windwalker," she said quietly, her voice carrying genuine remorse rather than the practiced apology of someone seeking public forgiveness. "I know I can never undo what I did. But I want you to know that I've spent 2 years trying to understand what I took from you and what your son's sacrifice meant. I was wrong in ways I didn't even comprehend at the time." Benjamin studied her face, recognizing the authentic regret that marked someone who had genuinely learned from their mistakes. "Mrs. Whitfield, my son died believing that people could change, that service and sacrifice could make the world better. Your presence here today suggests he was right." Their conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it was witnessed by neighbors who understood they were seeing reconciliation rather than simple apology. Karen's journey from perpetrator to penitent had taken 2 years of genuine soul-searching, community service with veteran organizations, and the humbling recognition that property values meant nothing compared to human dignity. As evening approached and visitors began departing, Benjamin found himself alone in the memorial garden with the granite marker bearing his son's name. The inscription read, "Lance Corporal Matthew Windwalker, United States Marine Corps. Died in service to his country, lived in service to others, remembered in service to all who sacrifice." The garden's design ensured that Matthew's stone caught the last light of day, illuminating words that had been chosen by his father, but reflected sentiments expressed by hundreds of visitors who had come to understand that some sacrifices echo across generations. Benjamin's phone buzzed with a text from Sergeant Major Blackhorse. "Tank, watching the ceremony coverage from Quantico. Matthew's flag is still flying high, brother. Still protecting people. Semper Fi." As darkness settled over Willowbrook Estates, Benjamin performed his evening flag ceremony, surrounded by neighbors who had learned to see honor rather than inconvenience in military traditions. The flag that flew over his home was no longer weathered and alone. It was one of dozens that marked a community where military families could find the respect and understanding they deserved. 2 years after one woman's attempt to erase a Marine's memory for the sake of property values, that Marine's legacy had created something unprecedented, a place where civilian and military communities lived together in genuine partnership, where sacrifice was honored rather than hidden, and where one father's love for his fallen son had sparked a movement that continued to protect families across the nation. Matthew Windwalker's service had ended on a mountainside in Afghanistan, but his mission continued in a subdivision in North Carolina, where his memory had taught an entire community the true meaning of honor, sacrifice, and the price of freedom. The flag still flew, the memory still lived, and the legacy still grew. One family, one community, one act of courage at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.